The moment an empath chooses peace over people, and I need you to understand what that moment actually looks like, because it doesn't look the way the motivational quotes on your timeline have been telling you it looks. It doesn't look like a powerful, cinematic decision made from a place of confidence and clarity and complete emotional wholeness. It doesn't look like someone walking away with their head high and their heart certain and their hands steady. Most of the time, it looks like someone sitting very still, in a quiet room, somewhere between exhausted and devastated, finally, too tired to keep choosing everyone else over themselves one more time. It looks like surrender before it looks like strength. It feels like loss before it feels like freedom. And the reason most people miss how significant this moment actually is, the reason it doesn't get the recognition it deserves, not from the outside world, and often not even from the empath herself, is because it arrives without fanfare, without a clear before and after, without anyone watching to confirm that something seismic just shifted. But something seismic just shifted. And by the end of this episode, whether you are an empath who has already had this moment, or one who is standing right at the edge of it, you are going to understand exactly what it means, exactly what it costs, and exactly what it unlocks in the human beings who are brave enough to finally, fully choose it. Let's start with who we're actually talking about, because the word empath gets used so broadly now that it's almost lost the specificity that makes it meaningful. We're not talking about someone who is simply kind or sensitive or emotionally aware in the way that most emotionally healthy people are aware. We're talking about someone whose entire experience of the world is filtered through other people's emotional states, often before their own. Someone who walks into a room and immediately, involuntarily, begins absorbing the atmosphere, who is tense, who is hurting, who is performing happiness they don't actually feel, who needs something they haven't asked for yet. Someone who has spent so much of their life oriented toward other people's emotional experiences that the question of what they themselves feel, separate from everyone else, is sometimes genuinely difficult to answer. This is not a gift without cost. This is not simply heightened compassion neatly packaged as a personality trait. This is a nervous system that never fully clocks off, that never fully stops scanning, that carries the emotional weight of every relationship and every room and every unspoken need it encounters, often without the person inside that nervous system even realizing how much they're carrying, until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. And here's the part that sets up everything that follows. Empaths, because of how they're wired, because of how attuned they are to what other people need, have an almost structural difficulty with something most people take completely for granted: the ability to disappoint someone and feel okay about it afterward. When an empath says no, it doesn't end with the no. It begins a lengthy internal process of second-guessing, of imagining the other person's experience of being told no, of feeling the disappointment they caused as though it happened to them, of constructing elaborate justifications for why the no was warranted, of sometimes quietly reversing the no in the middle of the night when the guilt becomes heavier than the boundary was worth. This is not weakness. This is what happens when empathy operates without a counterbalancing relationship with the self. When the ability to feel what others feel is not matched by an equally developed ability to feel what you feel and treat that as equally valid, equally important, equally worth protecting. Empaths are frequently extraordinary at advocating for everyone around them. The gap, the one that costs them everything, is in advocating for themselves with the same ferocity. So what happens over time when someone lives this way, perpetually giving, perpetually absorbing, perpetually choosing other people's comfort over their own at every junction where the two things come into conflict? What happens is not dramatic, and that's the thing that makes it so easy to miss until it's already happened. What happens is a slow, cumulative depletion that doesn't announce itself as depletion. It announces itself as tiredness first, just being tired more than seems reasonable. Then it moves into a kind of flatness, a muting of the emotional richness that used to be the empath's signature, a dimming of the curiosity and depth and aliveness that made them who they were. Then it starts showing up as resentment, the quiet, uncomfortable kind that the empath immediately feels guilty about feeling, because empaths are not supposed to resent the people they love, except that they do. They genuinely do. And the guilt of resenting people they genuinely care about adds another layer to the weight they're already carrying. And somewhere in all of that, somewhere in the tired and the flat and the quietly resentful and the guilty about the resentment, the empath starts to disappear. Not all at once, not in a way anyone names, but in the way a person disappears when they've been giving so much of themselves away for so long that they can no longer find the edges of where they end and everyone else begins. This is the landscape the empath is standing in when the moment arrives. And the moment, the actual moment of choosing peace over people, is usually catalyzed not by a grand realization, but by something almost absurdly ordinary. A conversation that asks too much when there's nothing left to give. A need that arrives from someone who has never once asked how she's doing. A moment of helping someone navigate a crisis at midnight and then sitting alone after, in the quiet, and realizing with a clarity that feels almost brutal that nobody is coming to sit with her in hers. It's not always that specific. Sometimes it's even quieter than that. Just a moment of stillness in which the empath looks at her own life, at all the relationships and commitments and people she's poured herself into, and feels something she doesn't immediately have a name for. It takes a moment to identify it, because it's unfamiliar. And then she identifies it. She feels empty. Not sad, not angry. Empty. Like a container that has been generously, continuously given from, until there is genuinely nothing left inside to offer anyone, including herself. And it's in that emptiness, counterintuitively, that something important becomes possible, because the noise has finally stopped. All the needs and all the requests and all the subtle emotional signals she's been intercepting and responding to have gone quiet long enough for her to hear something underneath all of it that she hasn't heard clearly in a very long time. Herself. What she actually needs. What she actually feels, not in relation to anyone else, not colored by what someone else needs from her, not filtered through the lens of how her feelings will land for the people around her, just her, raw, unmediated, unperformed. And what she hears is so simple, it almost seems too small to explain the magnitude of what's about to change because of it. What she hears is, "I cannot keep doing this." Not as a complaint, not as a manipulation, not as a threat she's issuing to anyone, just as the quietest, most honest, most uncomplicated statement of fact she has ever allowed herself to make. I cannot keep doing this. And for the first time, she doesn't immediately follow it with, but they need me, but it's not that bad, but what kind of person am I if I stop? For the first time, the statement just sits there, complete, without an apology attached to it. That is the moment. That is the exact moment an empath chooses peace over people. And the reason it's so significant, the reason it carries the weight it carries in the psychology of who this person is going to become after it, is not because of what she's choosing against. It's because of what she's choosing toward. Because peace, for an empath, is not the same thing as peace for most people. For most people, peace is the absence of conflict, the settling of things, the reaching of a comfortable equilibrium. For an empath, peace is something far more radical. Peace is the decision to stop treating her own inner world as the last priority in every situation. Peace is the decision to let someone else be uncomfortable without immediately taking responsibility for fixing it. Peace is the decision to experience her own life from the inside instead of perpetually from the outside, where everyone else's experience has always seemed more urgent, more real, more worthy of attention than her own. This is not selfishness. This is the return of a self that was never supposed to disappear in the first place. And the emotional intelligence required to make this choice, to see clearly enough through the conditioning of a lifetime, through the guilt and the people-pleasing and the compulsive caretaking, to choose yourself anyway, is not the absence of empathy. It is empathy, finally, turned inward. But here's what nobody tells you about the moment an empath makes this choice. What comes immediately after it is not relief. What comes immediately after it is the hardest thing she's ever had to feel. And it arrives before the freedom does, before the power does, before any of the things she's been told choosing herself will give her. It arrives first, and it arrives fully. And it is the thing that will determine whether this moment becomes a genuine turning point or just another intention that quietly collapses under the weight of everything she was trying to leave behind. And what that thing is, and why it's so specifically difficult for an empath to move through it, and what's waiting on the other side of it that changes everything. That is exactly where we are going next. What comes immediately after the moment an empath chooses peace is guilt. Not the mild, passing kind that most people feel when they've been slightly inconsiderate or forgotten something they should have remembered. The specific, heavy, almost suffocating guilt that belongs exclusively to people who have spent their entire lives measuring their worth by how much they give, how available they are, how reliably they show up for everyone around them, regardless of what it costs them personally. This guilt doesn't arrive politely. It arrives the moment she enforces the first boundary, the moment she says no to something she would previously have said yes to, while dying quietly inside. The moment she doesn't respond to the message that would have had her immediately dropping everything 6 months ago. It arrives, and it sounds exactly like her own voice, which is the particular cruelty of it, because it's hard to argue with something that sounds like you. It says things like, "Who do you think you are?" It says, "You're being selfish." It says, "The old you wouldn't have done this. The old you was better. The old you was kinder. The old you would have found a way." And the empath, still fresh in this choice, still standing in the unfamiliar territory of her own needs, has to hear all of that and keep going anyway. That is the hardest part, not the decision itself. The staying decided in the presence of a guilt response so deeply conditioned it can mimic conscience with terrifying accuracy. Here's what the empath needs to understand about that guilt, because understanding it is what makes it possible to move through it instead of being moved backward by it. That guilt is not wisdom. It is not her moral compass doing its job. It is a conditioned response that was installed over years, possibly decades, of learning, through family dynamics, through relationships, through 100 small moments of being rewarded for selflessness and made to feel wrong for self-preservation, that her value is directly proportional to her usefulness to others. It is the emotional equivalent of an alarm system that was calibrated so sensitively it goes off not when there's an actual threat, but whenever she simply stops performing the role that everyone around her became comfortable with her performing. The alarm says danger, but the danger it's detecting is not harm to anyone. The danger it's detecting is change, her change, and change for a nervous system that has organized itself around a particular role for a very long time feels indistinguishable from threat, even when it is the most necessary, most healing, most self-respecting thing she has ever done. So she sits with the guilt. She doesn't act on it. She doesn't let it make decisions for her the way it used to. She lets it be there, loud and uncomfortable, and sometimes almost unbearable, and she keeps going. And this specific act of feeling something difficult and continuing anyway is where the emotional intelligence that the title of this episode promised actually lives. Not in the grand gesture, not in the dramatic exit, in the quiet, daily, unglamorous practice of choosing her own peace in the face of every internal voice and external pressure that has ever told her that choosing herself is the same thing as failing the people she loves. It is not the same thing. It has never been the same thing. But it takes time to feel that distinction in the body instead of just understanding it in the mind. And the time it takes is not wasted. it is the work. Now let's talk about what starts happening on the other side of that guilt, because this is the part nobody who's never made this choice can tell you about, and the part that every empath who has made it will recognize immediately. Something starts returning. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, almost tentative increments, like something that has been underground for a long time and is slowly, carefully finding its way back toward light. The first thing that returns is energy, not the manic, caffeinated kind of energy, but a quieter, more sustainable version. The energy of not constantly running on empty because she's been filling everyone else's tank first. She notices she can think more clearly, that she has opinions again, preferences she'd stopped noticing she had, interests she'd quietly abandoned because maintaining them required time and attention she was always giving away before she got to herself. She notices she can sit in a room without immediately scanning it for who needs what. Not because the sensitivity is gone, the sensitivity is not gone, and it never will be, but because she is no longer compulsively at the service of it. She can feel a room and choose what to do with what she feels, rather than having the feeling automatically route itself into action on someone else's behalf before she's even consciously registered it. This is the beginning of what actual emotional intelligence looks like in an empath who has finally turned it inward. Because here's something the conversation around empathy almost never addresses honestly. Empathy without self-awareness is not a superpower. It is a liability. An empath who cannot regulate her own emotional experience, who cannot distinguish between what she feels and what she's absorbed from someone else, who cannot make a decision without running it through the filter of how everyone around her will respond to it. That empath is not operating from strength. She is operating from a nervous system that was never given the tools to protect itself, in a pattern that was probably handed to her by people who were also never given those tools, running on compassion that has curdled into compulsion because it was never balanced by the equally important ability to say, "Enough, not today, this is mine, and I am keeping it." Empathy turned inward, the ability to extend to yourself the same understanding, the same patience, the same genuine care that you have always extended so freely to everyone else. That is not the diminishment of the gift. That is the gift finally completing its circuit. And what this does to her relationships, the ones that survive this shift, is something genuinely worth paying attention to, because not all of them do survive it. And the ones that don't are the ones that were never actually relationships in the full sense. They were arrangements. Arrangements where she provided emotional labor, availability, patience, and care, and received in return the feeling of being needed, which she had somewhere along the way confused with being loved. When she stops being infinitely available, when she stops absorbing and fixing and showing up regardless of the cost, some people leave. And the leaving hurts, genuinely, even when she knew it was coming, even when she can see clearly that what's leaving wasn't serving her. It still hurts because she loved the people, even when the dynamic was broken. And empaths do not stop loving easily or quickly or cleanly. But here's what she discovers in the space those departures create. The relationships that remain are different in quality than anything she's had before. Because the people who stay when she becomes less convenient, who don't require her to be endlessly giving to justify their presence in her life, who actually show up differently when she shows up differently, those people were always there. She just couldn't see them clearly because the noise of the draining relationships was too loud and her own depletion too constant to notice who was genuinely beside her versus who was simply behind her, taking what she was offering. This is the inner power the title promised. Not power over anyone else, not power as dominance or control or the ability to make people behave differently. Power as ownership of her time, her energy, her emotional availability, her inner world. The power of a woman who knows, finally, what she is worth, and has stopped accepting less than that, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. The power of someone who has learned that the most loving thing she can do for the people in her life is to stop pretending she has infinite reserves, because the pretending was never generosity, it was performance. and performances eventually end, usually in collapse, and collapse serves nobody. Real generosity, the kind that's actually sustainable, the kind that comes from a full place rather than an empty one, requires that she be full first, that she fill herself first, not last, not after everyone else, not with whatever is left over after every other need has been met. First, which is not what she was taught, but it is what is true. So if you are an empath standing at the edge of this moment right now, feeling the pull of everyone who needs you, feeling the guilt of the peace you're starting to want, feeling the fear that choosing yourself means losing people, means being someone smaller or colder or less than who you've always been, I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say it. Choosing peace does not make you less of an empath. It makes you a sustainable one. It makes you someone whose love actually lands, because it comes from wholeness instead of depletion. It makes you someone who can be fully present with the people who matter, because you stopped spreading yourself across everyone who simply showed up. And the version of you on the other side of this choice, the one who has her energy back, her voice back, her edges back, the one who loves deeply and selectively, and from a place that doesn't require her to disappear to do it, that version of you is not a betrayal of who you've always been. She is the completion of it. She is who you were always supposed to become, before the world convinced you that everyone else's needs were more urgent than the quiet, persistent, long-ignored need to finally, fully come home to yourself.